Resident Evil 7 was released this week. We've spent some time with the game and we're ready to give you our first impressions. But first, let's take a look at what Resident Evil 7 actually is and how it's been received by critics.
Resident Evil 7 is the latest in the long-running survival horror series from Capcom, released January the 24th on PC, PS4 and Xbox One. It's a big departure for the series for two reasons. The first being a move away from the more action-adventure flavour of the last few entries to full-on survival horror. The second change is kind of there to facilitate the first change. It's a move to a first-person camera rather than the third-person angle that series fans are familiar with. This kind of hide-and-seek survival horror, which often leaves the player powerless or unable to fight back, has been popular for a few years now, thanks to the likes of Alien Isolation, Amnesia and Outlast. The early Resident Evil installments had rather clunky fixed camera angles. Capcom reinvented the series with Resident Evil 4, adopting an over-the-shoulder third-person view instead.
Resident Evil 7's first-person view is probably the biggest single change this series has seen. But what are people saying about the game now that it's finally here?
Well, the game has a Metacritic score of 86 at the time of recording and has received a warm reaction from critics. Destructoid gave a glowing review in which reviewer Zach Furness awarded a 10 out of 10, saying, "You're about to see something wonderful. We have the best Resident Evil game in 10 years.
In a mostly positive review, Eurogamer said Resident Evil goes back to its founding principles for a more cohesive and chilling breed of horror game that stops short of greatness. But warned, once you've acclimatized to Resident Evil 7's tactics, it seldom gives you much reason to be afraid of what lurks beyond."
The Guardian gave the game 5 stars and called it a truly shocking, challenging and terrifying experience.
Polygon gave the game 9 out of 10 and said, "Capcom has proved me wrong about the Resident Evil franchise."
YouTuber ACG said the game is absolutely a buy. Is it a classic? Probably not. Is it an incredible entry to the series? Without a shadow of a doubt.
In one of the more negative reviews out there, Time Magazine gave 2.5 stars out of 5. They said Resident Evil 7 looks backward for better and worse.
GameSpot gave 8 out of 10, but reviewer Scott Butterworth warned, "By the end of the campaign, I was ready for the game to be over."
IGN gave the game 7.7, calling it thrilling and atmospheric, but suggested it was too predictable. As soon as you're thrown into it, the first thing you notice is that the scenery and the atmosphere and the vegetation, the setting is really rich and colourful.
What I like so far is the kind of environmental storytelling where you'll be walking around and you'll pick something up and there'll be like a really creepy photo or something and you'll think, Jesus, what's happened here? And that's awesome. It's really gripping. And one thing that kind of facilitates that is the first person angle, which we definitely should talk about, the first person viewpoint. I think it works amazingly well. It really puts you right in there. I know that's what the intention is, but it generates this feeling of claustrophobia. To my mind, it's a brilliant move, putting it in first person.
Yeah, like the claustrophobia thing. At least with a third person camera, you can see people when they're running at you, and swiping at you and you're getting hurt. With a first person camera, the controls feel a little bit clunky trying to get away from people, and that's kind of frustrating for me. The other thing about the first person camera is that you never really get to know or see the protagonist or yourself, whereas in the previous games, you got to know them quite well, obviously, because you see them the whole time. I don't know whether that detracts from the overall connection with the game and the character.
The scale of this is a hell of a lot smaller. You're in one house for like an hour and a half in the beginning. There's nothing there that's scary other than seeing things like, going past in the corner of your eye and things like that. That's how they're trying to generate this feeling of horror this time, not with over-the-top monsters and so far, and that's what they're trying to do. And that's the only way it'll work, by making it first person and putting you in these small confined spaces. But like you said, it's difficult to maneuver and things like that in these spaces. And I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it tense. They're trying to, the reloading is really slow. And
let's talk about the combat.
The combat at first, I wasn't that big of a fan of it because it was a bit clunky, I thought, and it felt a little bit like a quick time event. Because the first combat experience you get pretty much is a quick time event. You're just clicking away, and then it happens automatically, more or less. And I didn't really like that. But once you kind of get some firearms and things like that, and you try every shot, you have to readjust your aim every time. The kick of the gun is quite realistic, so you have to recalibrate where you're kind of focusing on, and that's really good. That tension is really good, but again, it comes down to the controls where they're forcing this vulnerability on you by making things slow and difficult and quite hard to do.
And in the meantime, when you're shooting your gun, they're creeping ever closer towards you, and that builds up the tension. You got to reload, and it's slow. You shoot, and it's slow. It's this type of horror game. It's not the action-driven horror that we had in the previous.
I think the best comparison to make is Resident Evil 4, because that was like the blueprint for 5 and 6 after that. It is completely different. And one of the biggest changes, kind of gameplay-wise for me, is the inventory management. You've got to be very careful about what you pick up, and you've got to combine your items regularly to make space for other things. A shotgun takes up more space than a pistol because it's that kind of grid layout. So you've got to manage your inventory, which is awesome. I really like that. If it's going to be a survival horror game, you need that. You need to be worrying about where you're going to fit your pliers or whatever in your backpack, in your inventory space.
There's been a lot of debate about how alike it is to games like Outlast and Alien Isolation. In those types of games, the difference is that you've actually got an inventory here and you've got a gun, although as ineffective as it was for me in the first hour, apparently it becomes more of a shooter towards the end of the game. It's not just a coward simulator like a lot of the other games where you just run and hide and wait for them to go.
Although there are elements of that in it. There are segments of that in it.
In the beginning especially, I think. From the reviews that we've read, it opens up to more action oriented towards the end, whether that's the right way to term it, but there is definitely more, you
can do something about the enemies. But that is important to mention, that it's taking inspiration from those kind of things, because that is like a popular kind of trend, or it has been in the last few years. So I just think it's awesome that they've seen that and they've thought, well, Resident Evil 6 got slammed, people weren't too fond of Resident Evil 5. We've been doing the same thing since Resident Evil 4 now, maybe we should do something different. And they have done that. This is not like any Resident Evil game I've experienced before. And it's great. I'm really happy that they've tried to do something different. And to me, it's worked. I'm enjoying this, and I'm more engrossed by this than I ever was with 5 or 6. Because of that first-person perspective, because of the way it's trying to scare you, I'm always more afraid when I can't see what I'm supposed to be afraid of. And that it does that really well, at least in the first few hours.
I for one, was scared at certain points, whereas you probably weren't so much.
Yeah.
It threatens you the whole time. When you're actually cornered and you can't get away, it is scary. It's a scary game, in my opinion, because of the believable characters and the believable setting and how engrossed and immersed you are in this game. That adds to that scariness factor for me. Another thing that I liked was the characters and how well they looked and how well acted they were. They were believable. It was very tense interacting with these other characters, and it was, like I said, it was believable. It makes you appreciate what they've done with the game aesthetically. It's really a very good game in that sense.
It gets in your face and it gets campy and some silly horror tropes, they're paying homage to a load of movies and things like that. There are moments like that. It's just a little bit dialed back. The way that things are introduced to you is just a little bit more subtle. It's environmental storytelling where you're seeing hints of things and you're seeing evidence of things. It just lets your imagination run wild with what the hell is going on here. And that's an important point to discuss as well. Just the mystery of the whole plot and the setting and the narrative. How does it connect to the other Resident Evil games? That's something that Liam brought up in the office. How does this fit in the Resident Evil universe?
Because they always fit in some way, don't they?
Of course,
but does this one fit in? That's not overt at the start.
So far, anyway, it feels completely separate to everything we've seen before. There's no recognisable characters. The big kind of villains that we're familiar with aren't there. It is intriguing. You want to find out, how does this fit in with everything? Even as someone who's just a passive fan of the series, I want to know, where does it fit in with everything else, which is cool.
It's not without its criticisms, though. For me, the AI was a bit stupid at times. It kind of almost immersion breaking. You want to believe it, but when the enemies are looking at you dead on and you're cowering behind a couch and it can kind of see you.
If you're not cowering quite enough, then they can see you. But if you just hide just slightly more behind whatever the object is, then suddenly you're invisible to them. It's a little bit weird.
So it's those little types of immersion breaking AI faults that kind of detract from it a little bit.
Having played Alien Isolation as well and loved that game, they're trying to simulate that alien experience where the alien's roaming around and you're having to achieve something, you're trying to get out the room or something. In Alien, it's almost entirely dynamic, so you can be trying to do something and suddenly the alien will appear. Whereas this is heavily scripted, and it feels like if you die a certain way, that exact thing will happen again, unless you do something different. So
yeah, they can be quite predictable, which is one of the other criticisms that we saw in a couple of the reviews that we read too. Before we round up then, it is worth mentioning that there is DLC being released pretty much within a week of it being published. So I personally think it's bullshit, and they should finish the game and you sell you a game, not most of a game, and then sell you the little bit like a week later.
They call it a banned footage volume 1, which is out like next week pretty much, and that's $9.99. We don't know what the UK price is yet. And then there's a second piece which is out 2 weeks after that, in kind of mid-February, which is banned footage volume 2. So do what you want with that.
It is worth noting that this game is pretty much finished on release, which is it's against industry norms these days. Like there's no day one patch. It went gold like 3 or 4 weeks ago, I saw on Twitter. So they've done their best to make this a complete game on day one. Fair play. They've released the game in good working order.
So whether you're a fan of the series or not, it's good to see an established franchise trying to do something new. Isn't it Assassin's Creed? Resident Evil 7 looks, feels and plays like nothing else in the series. It's more about atmospheric horror, not action horror.
For us, there's little doubt that it is a good game. But whether it's boring and repetitive or a terrifying masterpiece will purely come down to your taste and tolerance for the first-person horror genre. It may not be a masterpiece, nor the instant classic that Resident Evil 4 was, but it's damn enjoyable to play.
So that's Resident Evil 7, guys, and that's what we think about it. Have you had a chance to pick up the game yet? What do you think about it? Let us know down in the comments. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Do please check out more of our content right here. We'll see you next time.